From Their Eyes, a Shadow of the Colossus Ico fic. Chapter 19, The Queen's Sacrifice. The woman once known as Mono sat in her throne in the castle. In the years since the Shadow Queen had been bound to the form of the dead mortal girl, she had found many of the encased horned children brought to the castle. While most of them had physically died, their spirits helped to become newer and stronger shadow beings. Even the figure Dorman had been bound to was later put in one of those cases. It was then she was made aware of the second purpose of the cases, something none of the beings who brought the sarcophagi here understood. Each one would preserve a piece of the body, which could then be used to create another being. That had been part of the plan, since as time passed she felt her body starting to lose form. She even saw it now, as more of her arms were pure shadow than solid. It was good that she was able to cast the spell now for the master plan. The first part had been to create a new body for her to occupy, one that had life in it to begin with. Not only would it last longer than this one, but it would allow her to leave the castle. She had already seen it would be possible, but that was due to a rather unfortunate turn of events. She had not foreseen that the last body delivered would manage to break free of his sarcophagus, and then further complicate the plans by trying to get her daughter, Yorda, out of the castle. She thought for a moment where that name came from. Dorman had told her that the body had to have a name for the spell to fully work. She didn't like that part, but knew it was the right move. Names had power. Maybe the name Yorda had a power all its own, and maybe it was linked to the woman whose body it was before. She wondered if that name had given Yorda a will of her own. That might explain the willingness to go with the boy. The fact that he had broken Yorda out of the cage she had placed her in was an obvious factor as well. She had been glad she had stopped them and sent the horn boy to his death. It wouldn't be a waste, since it happened within the confine of the castle area. As she focused on that thought, she heard Dorman's voice speak to her. "You needn't worry about that momentary problem. Everything at this point will play out for our benefit. Soon we will have all the power we need to take control of this world. In fact, we will have so much, we can spread our control elsewhere." The thought of that gave her much delight. To be able to spread her controlling darkness everywhere is what she wanted. She looked out, seeing the glow starting in the walls. The spell was starting, and that meant the transfer would start happening. She closed her eyes and mentally spoke to Dorman. "You think we will be able to control that world you had been imprisoned, and even beyond it?" She had heard from her minions about the power in that land, and they sensed even more dead bodies beyond that land. So many spirits to feed on and add to their power. She paused for a moment, noticing a presence approaching. For a moment she turned herself invisible to observe who it was. Something in her couldn't believe who it was, but as the horn boy entered the room, she realized how much of a problem he was going to be. He also had that cursed sword, which was something she needed to make sure couldn't hurt her. Once he stepped away from the throne, she revealed herself again. She had one last card to play to make him leave. She did know, however, that if he left without using the sword, it would no longer be effective. She would be in her new body. She called out to him, and right away he turned and came back, demanding what she did to Yorda. She glared at him for a moment, also noticing how much of her body was now shadow as the spell continued. Silence, boy. You're too late. My body has become too old and won't last much longer, but Yorda's going to grant me the power to be resurrected. To be my spiritual vessel is the fulfillment of her destiny. She wasn't lying about that. It was why she created Yorda in the first place. When next her body wakes, Yorda will be no more. She then motioned to the door. Now put down your sword and leave. This is what she would want you to do. Judging by the glow in the walls, he might reach the end of the bridge before the spell not only claimed him, but turned him to stone. To her shock, the boy didn't take the offer, but swung the sword at her. She had put the barrier up in time to send the sword flying out of his hands and out into the room. He had made his choice, and now she had to eliminate him before he could ruin things. She started to charge up a blast of magic to do that. To her astonishment, he was smart enough to find shelter from the blasts. She hoped he hadn't noticed how long it took her to power up the spell. She had to take time, as she also had to keep the barrier up in the meantime. The sword could kill her if she wasn't ready. Multiple times he managed to get the sword and attack her. She kept knocking it away with her protective shield, but each clash reduced it. If she hadn't started the big spell, she could maintain this for a while. Each attack allowed him to weaken her barrier more. She didn't like that, since he was doing it so faster than the spell would finish. It wouldn't matter so much if he killed her just as the spell finished, but if it happened before, it would be a disaster. The castle was glowing brighter now, which meant the spell was soon complete. In fact, it felt like the spell would be complete in a few seconds. As the light was at what had to be its brightest, she felt the sword break the barrier and get impaled into her. She tried to get a last jab in, but her words were weak. She wasn't even sure if the boy heard them, but it didn't matter. He had already lost. As her sight faded, she heard Dorman's voice again, but his words were not a comfort. I am sorry, but the spell was not complete. Your essence wasn't fully transferred. Do not worry, however, as the spell had a second purpose that it was able to fulfill. The news had surprised her. She was unaware of any second part to the spell. She was aware of the castle starting to crumble, and even she noticed that Yorda's body was saving the boy. In fact, she could even sense it dividing into two forms. One was Yorda as a shadow being, and the other was her physical form. She wondered what that meant. At that moment, she felt Dorman's essence joining her own, as if both their essences were combining. As that happened, Dorman spoke to her again. There was a secret to this castle that you weren't aware of. At the very core of this castle was the magical source of its power. The spell I told you to invoke had a fail-safe in it. You see, Now your essence and mine will be merging with that power source. We can then use it to reshape this world in our image." Those words encouraged her. They could now get control of this land. They wouldn't be able to move, but they would take over. She felt them enter the power source, and also felt the castle crumble around them. In fact, the whole structure it stood on started to collapse as well, sinking into the lake around them. It would take some time, but they would control this land. They would corrupt it and drain the water from the lake, turning it into a corrupt valley. They would restructure the area around them and also corrupt the remaining species of colossi in the world. After the great battle long ago, many had headed away from the castle area. They would be able to kill the last of them as well. This valley would be the start of what they would take over and grow their power to invade other worlds from their solitary spot.